Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's another drawing of mountains in colored pencil. There are some interesting shapes and contrasts here, so let's have a look. The surface I'm going to be using is a 1000 grit sandpaper and the pencils are Faber Castell Polychromos. The first thing I'm going to do is work out the composition, so just a little bit of sketching. We have some interesting shapes here, like I said, a couple of mountain ridges and a few mountain peaks, and because the ones in the foreground are stretching out towards our viewpoint, they are so much closer to us, there's going to be more contrast there and some darker colors, whereas the peak in the background, in the middle, is going to be a bit lighter and more bluish because of the atmospheric effect. But I don't really need a very complex sketch to begin with. I can go right into the main part of the drawing process, and now I'm starting to work on the sky, and for that I'm going to use a light phthalo blue for the most part. So it's going to be a nice blue sky with just a few clouds here and there. Now if the background color, if the color of your sandpaper is a little bit too dark, and mine was a slightly darker gray, you can tone it a bit with some gouache or watercolor. And I used just a light layer of white gouache to make it a bit lighter, and that made painting the sky a lot easier, or drawing the sky a lot easier, because when the background color is much darker, then it can be a little bit more difficult for me to achieve the target color. But when it's lighter, when it's closer in value to the color I'm trying to achieve, it's easier because I can rely a bit more on blending and I need less coloring. Either way, I still need to cover this whole area fairly thoroughly with my light phthalo blue, because I don't really want too much of the gray breaking through, because it would get too dull, but I can still do a bit of blending. And for blending I normally use tortillons, and these are homemade tortillons. I usually have a few of them lying around for different colors, because when they pick up a little bit of color, you can use them to blend only with that color or similar colors, so I don't want to muddy the colors. So right now I'm starting to work on the clouds, and for that I'm using a white colored pencil. That's what I'm going to start with, but I'm going to soften the transition between the lighter white parts of the clouds and the slightly more transparent ones with tortillons and with a cool gray, with a very light cool gray. So that's what I'm going to use to make this transition a bit smoother. So right now I'm just trying to come up with some interesting shapes of the clouds, and once I do that part of the background, because I normally work from left to right and from top to bottom, once I do that part of the background, I'll be ready to move on to the mountain itself. So as I've already explained, for softening these shapes a little bit, I'm using a tortillon. I'm using a different one now because the ones that I used for blending the background has already picked up a little bit more of the blue color. And this works on this surface because this surface is a lot different than regular paper, so colored pencils behave differently, and you can layer lighter colors on top of the darker ones more easily, and you can also blend a bit more easily. And that allows you to create some interesting effects, and also, most importantly, to work from dark to light, adding lighter details at will. Like I said, for softening this lower part of the clouds, which is facing away from the light source, I'm using this light gray. This is a cool light gray, which will make for a nice transition between this slightly darker blue and of course the white colored pencil. So I have some nice wispy looking clouds there, and I may add a few more of them here and there, but first I will just do a little bit more of the background here in the top right area, and do a bit more blending as well. And after that I'll move on to the main part of the scene, which is of course the mountain. Now the mountain is going to have its light side and shadow side, and in this case the light is coming more from the right side, which means that the left side of all of these shapes will usually have a bit more shadow. Of course the light is also coming from above, but it's the light source is positioned more on the right. So that's what I'll need to keep in mind while I'm drawing all of these shapes, all of these rocks, mountain peaks, ridges, etc. Now to make things a bit more complicated, within the shadow side there are also some lighter shapes, because there's also some snow, because some parts of the mountain are covered with snow, others are just bare rocks. So some of those areas will be lighter than others, and I need to find a way to keep that contrast between the light side and the shadow side, so that I could express the volume, or so that I could show the volume of those objects, because without achieving that contrast, the mountain and the peaks won't really look three-dimensional. So I still need to make sure that the light side is lighter than the shadow side. So these lighter shapes or lighter marks that I'm drawing here on the right side need to be at least a little bit lighter than those lighter areas on the left in the shadow side, because obviously the snow that is on the shadow side of the mountain is not going to be white, it's going to be gray, slightly lighter gray maybe, but still darker than the snow on the light side of the mountain. So I think you can already see a little bit of that contrast on this mountain peak, on this tallest mountain peak in the middle, where this left side of the peak is a bit darker. Obviously the shapes will be a bit more complex, and now I'm adding some of these details. I'm adding some of those bare parts of the mountain which are not covered with snow, where we just see some rocks, and I'm trying to come up with some interesting details and shapes. I started out with one of the dark blues, but I figured that the indigo blue, which is darker and duller, almost kind of like a dark gray with a bluish component, I figured that works best for the shadow side of the mountain. But for this mountain ridge in the foreground, I'm even going to use some black colored pencil. I'm going to use some even darker colors. But here, here in this stage, I'm trying to work out the shape of these mountains, and to add some smaller shapes to this larger shape of a mountain, to break up this larger shape into slightly smaller shapes before I start shading them individually and defining their topography. And for this, again, I use that dark indigo blue, and that's going to be one of the main colors I'm going to use for the shadow side of the mountain. So here I decided to cover a good part of this left side of the mountain with this dark blue color, and after that I am going to do some blending. But before I do that, I'm cleaning up the edges. I want to have a really clean edge between the mountain and the background, so that we can tell where the mountain ends and the background begins. And I want to add a few light clouds here and there, here at the bottom as well, and that will also help me make some of these mountain peaks stand out even better against the background, because there will be more contrast. Now, once this left side of the mountain is covered, I can maybe add some other tones to it. Like here at the bottom, I can add a bit more of this lighter grey because I want to achieve a slightly foggy effect. And here at the top I want to add some bluish tones maybe, because that part of the mountain is further away up in the clouds and further away from our viewpoint, and because of the atmospheric effect it's going to appear a little bit maybe a little bit less defined, a little bit more bluish with less detail, less contrast and less texture. After that I'm going to pick up another tortillon and start blending. Now as I always say, you should try to allow the pencil to work for you, and the pencil will always create a bit of texture on its own. So when you blend, you will remove a lot of that texture, or you will soften a lot of that texture. Now here, because this is rocky terrain, you want to keep some of that texture, so you might want to control the amount of blending and the amount of pressure that you're using when blending. So you want to keep some of that texture. You blend it just a little bit and you leave some of those marks like suggestions of some rocky, angular, rough shapes on that slope of the mountain. Now here in the foreground I am using a black colored pencil, so I'm switching to some slightly warmer and darker tones here. So I will want to achieve several types of contrast in this scene, because this distant part of the mountain, which is further away from our viewpoint, is going to be lighter, it's going to appear cooler, it's going to appear more bluish, it's going to be less defined in terms of shape, contrast and texture. But the ridge, the part of the mountain ridge in the foreground, which is closer to us, is going to be darker, it's going to be a bit warmer in color, and it's going to have more contrast and more texture. On this shadow side of the mountain, I am trying to add some lighter details using this cool gray to make this side of the mountain a bit more interesting. I'm adding some snowy patches, lighter patches here and there, and some of them are going to be slightly smaller than the others. Some of them are going to be slightly longer, kind of stretching out nearly down the whole length of this mountain. And I want to make some irregular looking shapes just to make it look natural and to create some suggestions of a rough mountain terrain. And I always have to keep in mind that this is the shadow side, so those lighter marks can't be too light. I still need to explain to the viewer that even though these snowy patches, these lighter patches are lighter overall, they are still in the shadow side, facing away from the light source, so they can't be quite as light as some of the snowy bits on the right side, on the light side of the mountain. Here in the foreground, I'm going to move in with some warmer colors, and I'm using this sanguine colored pencil, which is like dull, slightly darker orange color, maybe a reddish orange brown. I don't really know how to describe it, but it's a slightly duller color in comparison to orange, but it's still a lot warmer and brighter than some of the tones that I use for the background, for the mountain peak in the background. So I thought that it would be nice to establish this contrast not only in terms of the amount of value and texture and things like that, but also in terms of the temperature of the colors, because the part of the mountain which is closer to us is going to be a lot warmer in color, more brownish and even more reddish, orangey brown, whereas those peaks all the way in the back will be lighter and more bluish. I'm finishing this part of the sky here, On the right side, doing a little bit more blending with a tortillon, and after that I'm gonna work out the shape of this light side of the mountain peak here. Because this part on the right is slightly facing away from the light source, there's going to be a bit of shadow here. So that part of the slope is going to be casting a shadow onto this light side of the mountain. So there's a lot of variation in value because there's a lot of variation in the shape of the terrain. And I just have to go with it and try to define these relationships between lighter and darker areas as best as I can. As for the reference, if you want to check it out, it's going to be in the description, so you can see how I adapted to the reference. Even though I don't really stick to the reference photo religiously, I just sometimes use it as a general idea. Sometimes I try to make it a little bit closer to the reference, but I always improvise a little bit here. I decided to stretch the mountain a little bit to fit into my composition. Anyway, for the middle part of this ridge in the foreground, I'm going to use a slightly lighter color, which is cinnamon. The cinnamon is lighter but also a bit cooler than the sanguine, which I used in the lower left corner. So I'm going to try to make a transition between those warmer colors in the lower right corner towards the lighter and cooler colors towards the middle and the top of the drawing. And here I'm using this cinnamon colored pencil to define the light side of those shapes of those ridges. And you can see that the shapes are already starting to come up. They're already starting to look a little bit three-dimensional because I've already defined the light side. But I want to add a touch of that sanguine to some of those shapes because, like I said, I want to have a gradient. And then I'm using this indigo, dark indigo again, to define the left edge of this ridge so that it would stand out as a separate object against the peak and the slope in the background. That's very important. I don't want these two shapes to blend in. I want the shape in the foreground to stand out as a separate shape against the shapes in the background. So I'm going to use a slight edge to value there by making the shadow side of that ridge a little bit darker and the background color of that slope a bit lighter. A few more clouds here in the background on the right side. Just so that we would have something in that part of the background as well. With the clouds it's relatively easy because you don't really have to worry too much about their shape unless you're really focusing on the clouds in that particular landscape. But here they're not really that important, they're just a part of the background, so I don't really have to spend too much time refining them. I'm going to spend most of the time working on the mountain. I want to make sure that this shadow on the light side of the mountain is a little bit lighter than the shadows on the dark side of the mountain. So I hope that I'm making sense, because it's very important to keep that contrast between the light side and the shadow side, even when things are a little bit complicated and a little bit confusing as they are here. It's just something to keep in mind, the position of the light source. And now I'm using a black colored pencil to add some suggestions of details, cracks, bumps in the terrain on this part of the ridge here, closer to the foreground. So I'm just going to add some darker shapes here And again, I'm trying to stay consistent with the light source, because I'm always thinking that the light is coming from the right side and casting a bit of shadow to the left. So we're going to have some of these larger rocks and cracks, which are going to be casting a little bit of shadow. And on top of that, I can work a little bit more with that sanguine, but I can also allow some of the background grayish color to break through. And I can also add some lighter marks, lighter details with a cinnamon colored pencil to make a transition towards those cooler, lighter parts of the mountain. So I like the shadow side on this small peak here, and now I'm gonna start adding some more detail to the light side of this ridge. Again, I'm gonna use this indigo color, but here I'm going to try to make a transition between those darker shapes which I drew with a black colored pencil and the ones that I'm going to draw with a dark blue, and I'm going to gradually make them lighter and lighter. And I'm just adding a bit of that darker blue between those lighter shapes, lighter marks which I drew previously. And I'm even adding a touch of light phthalo blue to some parts of those shadow areas, because now I want to make some of them a bit lighter. Of course, I'm going to blend here as well, and again I'm going to try to control the amount of blending I do, because I want to retain some of the texture. But here in the foreground I want to have a little bit more texture, and then getting smoother and less defined as we go further up, closer to that mountain peak on the right. So now I'm going to define the shape of those peaks, which are a little bit further away, but which are a part of this ridge here in the foreground. But like I said, this peak is much further away from us now, so I'm going to be switching to some cooler and cooler colors here. But first I have to define the darker shapes, and then I'm going to go on drawing some lighter shapes, adding more grayish tones and making a bit of a transition between those grayish and bluish tones and the cinnamon reddish tones which I have in the midground and the foreground. On the top here I need some lighter shapes, so again a little bit of snow between those two mountain peaks, where maybe we still have a little bit of snow, but the peaks themselves are mostly rocky and bare. So that's just going to make the appearance of these peaks a little bit more interesting, a bit more complex. And I'm trying to see what kind of shapes I can come up with. This is often a back and forth process, as I'm sometimes adding some lighter details and some darker details on top, then going back in with some lighter details. But the reason why I can afford to do this is because I'm working on a sanded surface, which allows me to work both from dark to light and from light to dark. So I can easily add multiple layers, and I can easily add these fine light details on top. Here I'm doing some additional cleaning up around the edges of those peaks. Again, I want the shape of the mountain to stand out nice against the background. It's very important to have that clean edge. And I'm basically putting down the finishing touches on this part of the slope which is facing to the right, and just adding a few more details with a cinnamon colored pencil to finish that transition between the warmer parts of the mountain and the cooler parts of the scene. So now the drawing is done, and I'm just gonna put my signature in the lower right corner, and that's it. Don't forget to subscribe, give me a like, comment, and if you want to see longer videos, more content, real-time footage, you should check out my Patreon. That would be all for this drawing. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.